The moment I knew something was off, Darren Mays, associate GC and walking liability in a designer belt, leaned across the table and said, "Let's not make this difficult, Sam. Just sign it." Like we were swapping Girl Scout cookies and not certifying a legal attestation to the feds. He smiled like he was handing me a latte, not asking me to commit perjury. I stared back, pen in hand, while my instincts lit up like a Vegas slot machine stuck on jackpot. We were in conference room 4B. No windows, stale coffee smell, and that humming fluorescent flicker that always made it feel like the walls were closing in. The form was already pre-filled. My name typed neatly on the signature line. All it needed was my hand to betray my spine. Let me pause for a second. If you're listening and you care about this kind of story, about what happens when someone in the back office actually says no, hit that like button and subscribe. It's free and it means more than you think. 97% of people never do, and yet those clicks are how we keep telling stories like this. Stories where quiet people fight back, with paper, back to the room. Darren tapped the page like a toddler denied dessert. "Sam," he said, drawing out the A like I needed a lullaby. "This is routine. Every compliance lead signs this. You've done it for what, 6 years now?" "Yeah, 6 years. 6 years of staying late to cross-check audit trails, cross-reference vendor contracts, log internal control gaps. I wasn't the kind of person who skimmed and signed. I'd seen what happened when people did that. When they assumed someone else had done the checking, someone else had made sure all the boxes weren't just ticked, but justified. In those 6 years, my signature had never been a rubber stamp. And that's exactly what he wanted now. I flipped to the procurement appendix. Line 42 jumped out. Feneltech Systems. I blinked. We terminated that vendor 9 months ago after a failed background compliance sweep. Why were they listed as active, reviewed, and cleared? I flipped 2 more pages. An entry for Varnum Shipping showed an audit completed in June. Funny, my calendar said I was out sick that week and no one else was qualified to run Varnum's audit trail but me. That wasn't just sloppy. That was deliberate. "This isn't clean," I said finally, keeping my voice flat. Darren sighed theatrically. "We have to submit by Friday. If I delay, we fix it." I cut in. "I'm not signing until I validate every entry." I could feel the frost creep into my own tone. My job wasn't to make Darren's life easier. It was to make sure that when federal regulators looked at our filings, they didn't find fiction. He leaned back in his chair, that smirk gone rigid. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." I gathered the packet, stood, and walked out without another word. Let him stew in his impatience. I had work to do. I printed a clean version of the attestation and began redlining every discrepancy, every vendor that didn't belong, every log that didn't match the system archive. By midnight, I'd finished my internal memo. 19 flagged issues, 5 high risk. I copied legal, risk, my supervisor, and blind copied my personal legal inbox. Attached to the email was the memo and a single line typed in bold beneath it. "I cannot, in good faith, sign this attestation as it currently stands." I signed that line physically, ink, dated. And that, I thought, would be the end of it. A delay. Maybe some grumbling, a few meetings, then corrections, reconciliation, resubmission. That's how it always went. Clean up the mess, plug the holes, and file late with a disclaimer. It wasn't heroic. It was just what you did when the stakes were high and the timeline was stupid. But this time, no one responded. No corrections were made, and 2 weeks later, my calendar cleared itself. Compliance reviews I used to lead vanished. Logs I had access to revoked. Invitations to risk meetings gone. One by one, my responsibilities evaporated, quietly, neatly, almost like they were unassigning me from my own job. I didn't scream, I didn't protest, I documented. Because if there's one thing compliance teaches you, it's this: never argue when you can just file a better record. 2 days after I sent the memo, Darren Mays reappeared like a sitcom character who never quite got written out. Same smug face, same 2 white teeth, same overconfidence marinated in law school debt and startup Kool-Aid. He stood in my doorway, arms folded, and said, "You free for a second?" Not really. I was cross-checking purchase orders against the procurement ledger and had just found a $1.2 million entry labeled Vendor XZ Compliance Cleared. Vendor XZ didn't exist in our database, our contracts archive, or our third-party risk system, but I nodded anyway. Compliance analysts don't get the luxury of saying no to legal, especially when legal's playing offense. We walked down the hall. I noticed how quiet it had gotten around me, like people were watching, or worse, already informed. Conference room 4B again, same flicker, same stale air, same folder already waiting for me at the table. Darren didn't sit. He stood behind the chair opposite me and placed both hands on the backrest like he was posing for a press shot. "Sam," he started. That faux patient tone slathered over every syllable like syrup over burnt pancakes. "I read your memo. Thorough, as always." "Then you know I can't sign it," I replied. I kept my voice even, professional, controlled. I've always believed the loudest person in the room is usually the one most afraid of losing control. He gave that pitying lawyer smile, the one that always means you just don't understand how the world works. "It's not about perfection, Sam. It's about alignment. These filings don't exist in a vacuum. If we miss deadlines, it triggers flags. If we delay, we look dysfunctional. Optics matter." "Fraud matters more," I said. That wiped the smirk off his face. I kept going. "You listed Feneltech as reviewed. They were flagged for non-compliance in Q3. They failed their onboarding rescreening and were terminated before the fiscal close. We reactivated them," he said quickly. "Interim measure." "Then where's the updated risk assessment?" I asked. "Where's the approval log? The revised Tier 2 classification?" Silence. He shifted his weight, gripped the chair tighter. "Look," he said finally, "I'm not asking you to lie, just to trust the process. We'll clean it up downstream." "I don't sign fiction," I said, "and you know it." That was when the smile came back, but smaller, thinner, like a hairline crack in a windshield you pretend isn't growing. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "And you're asking me to sign my name to a lie," I said. "So here we are." For a few seconds, we just stared at each other. No shouting, no drama, just the weight of quiet non-compliance hanging in the air like cigarette smoke in a locked car. He picked up the folder, too fast. "Fine," he said. "You've made your position clear." I left the room and went straight back to my desk, pulled up the procurement logs again. If they were reactivating vendors without the compliance office, that was more than sloppy. It was systemically unsafe. Either someone upstairs thought they could hide it, or they genuinely believed no one would check. I checked. By Thursday, my access to the vendor ledger had been restricted. Just a red banner. "Permission denied. Please contact your administrator." No email, no warning, just a silent wall between me and the data I was hired to protect. The next morning, I walked past the risk team's weekly sync and saw my name was no longer on the attendee list. Not optional, not declined. Just gone. Like I'd never been invited in the first place. It didn't feel like punishment, not exactly. It felt like erasure, which honestly was worse. Because people don't erase you unless they're planning to rewrite the story. I didn't sleep that night. Not out of panic. I've dealt with worse. But from that sharpened stillness that hits you when you realize you're no longer dealing with incompetence. You're dealing with intention. I brewed a pot of coffee at 1:14 a.m. and opened a new draft on company letterhead. The subject line? Redacted objection to FY attestation. I wrote like a surgeon works. Clean, methodical, with zero room for interpretation. I laid it all out. Dates, procurement anomalies, audit gaps, missing signatures, and the precise compliance protocol violations. I cited internal policy 14.30.6 and cross-referenced SEC guidance on false attestations. I noted the discrepancy between procurement logs and the current vendor list, and even included screenshots with timestamps in case someone got creative later and tried to retroactively doctor the audit trail. Then, in bold at the bottom, I wrote, "I am formally declining to sign the current attestation due to unresolved compliance discrepancies. Proceeding without rectifying these items constitutes a material misrepresentation of internal controls." I copied legal, risk, and my direct manager, along with myself, at both my work and private encrypted email. I didn't trust our archive system. I didn't trust Darren. And I sure as hell didn't trust whoever decided Vendor XZ deserved $1.2 million of clean audit cover. By morning, no one responded, not even an auto reply. I walked into the office and found that my terminal wouldn't let me access the vendor master record. Where there had once been a searchable list sortable by compliance level, I now got an access revoked banner in company beige. I tried the audit logs next. Same result. My credentials were now read only for systems I'd spent years maintaining. I walked to IT, asked if something had gone wrong with permissions. Mike, the lead sysadmin, blinked twice and said, I was told legal wanted it that way. Said there was a restructuring of access tiers. I thanked him. Politely, pretended it wasn't a lie. Walked back to my desk, logged every permission I'd lost, time-stamped the changes, took screenshots of every error message, emailed them to myself, and encrypted the file. By noon, my calendar started thinning. The quarterly compliance wrap-up, removed. The cross-functional risk review, gone. Invitations to vendor review panels, dead. That Friday, I passed Darren in the hall. He didn't make eye contact, just kept walking like I was a janitor mopping a floor he didn't want to step on. For the first time in 6 years, I wasn't included in the annual certification meeting. That's like removing the pilot from the cockpit mid-flight and handing the controls to the guy who restocks the pretzels. The deadline for attestation passed. No follow-up, no revised draft, just silence. A thick, coordinated silence, and still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't have something to say, because I knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted a gap, a pause, a cooling off period long enough for them to bury my refusal under a new submission, one I'd never see, one that maybe, just maybe, they hoped I wouldn't notice or wouldn't fight if I did. That's the part no one tells you about corporate pressure. It's not loud. It's not a smoking gun or a slammed door. It's erasure through omission. Silence becomes strategy. Delay becomes denial. But I wasn't sleeping through this. I bought a new burner drive that weekend. I backed up everything: memos, email chains, screenshots, system logs from before my access was cut. And then I wrote a single-page affidavit. Not to send, not yet. Just to preserve the timeline. Signed it, notarized it, scanned and encrypted it. One copy went to a secure vault folder only I could access. The other I handed off to a lawyer I trusted from a past ethics training session. I didn't scream. I didn't confront. I did what I was trained to do. I built a case, because I didn't know when the breach would come. But I knew damn well it was coming. 3 months crawled by in that uneasy corporate quiet, the kind where everyone walks a little faster, closes doors a little more softly, and speaks in the kind of coded half-sentences that die before they make it down the hall. I wasn't invited to anything meaningful anymore. My workload shrank to the kind of tasks you assign an intern you don't trust with real responsibility. The quarterly compliance audit prep came and went without a single document routed through me, and I didn't ask why. Instead, I watched, logged, waited. Then, one gray Wednesday morning in March, I walked into the office kitchen to find 2 managers whispering like teenagers caught stealing beer. All I caught were fragments. Regulator visit, unannounced, apparently smooth. And then, the part that landed like a stone in my gut. We passed, clean, didn't even ask questions. Clean. A surprise federal review. And somehow, magically, the department that had locked me out of its own logs managed to clear it without a single flagged item. I kept my face still, poured coffee, stirred it slowly, walked out like nothing had shifted inside me, even though my pulse had started tapping an irregular beat against my ribs. Back at my desk, I opened the public filings portal. I've used it 1,000 times, but I typed my credentials slower than usual, like my fingers knew what my mind didn't want to face yet. When the portal loaded, I searched our company name, Norbridge Capital, proudly non-transparent since 2004, and opened the most recent attestation. There it was. Filed on time, stamped, accepted, and my name, my full legal name, neatly typed above a signature line, a signature that wasn't mine, not a digital signature, not a scan of my actual signed refusal memo. This was something else. A clean, smooth, almost too perfect stylized version of my name, slanted just enough to look handwritten, but wrong. Wrong proportions, wrong tilt, Wrong pressure pattern, wrong person. My throat didn't close, my hands didn't shake. Instead, a cold, quiet clarity snapped into place like a puzzle piece I should have seen months ago. They filed it. They forged me, and they gambled that I'd either never check or never fight. I downloaded the PDF, twice, then again, saved copies to 2 encrypted folders, printed a hard copy for the safe. After that, I extracted the metadata. I checked creation time, modification time, the device signature attached to the source document. Some of it was redacted. Of course it was, but not all. There were fingerprints left behind. Always are when people think they're smarter than the system. Next, I pulled every internal log I still had access to, email timestamps, version histories, the last clean snapshot of the vendor ledger before they blocked me. Then I cross-referenced dates. The day they cut my access, the day they removed me from meetings, the day the final attestation was filed. The pattern formed instantly. They'd isolated me first, then created the space to insert a forgery, then relied on corporate inertia to carry it forward. But I wasn't dealing with gossip anymore, or politics, or office pettiness. This was a federal filing, a falsified federal filing with my name on it. I sat back in my chair and let out one long, controlled breath. That's all. No panic, no raised voice, just the hard, precise focus that comes from understanding the scale of what someone has just risked with your identity. I drafted no email. I confronted no one. Instead, I started building another folder, one with a name I'd never used before in my personal archive. Attestation fraud, evidence set A. Inside it, I placed every file, every screenshot, every export, every discrepancy. I locked it with a 40-character passphrase and created a mirrored encrypted copy. I didn't know exactly when the reckoning would arrive, but after seeing that signature, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. When it did, I wouldn't have to say a word. I didn't sleep that night either, but this time it wasn't nerves. It was purpose. There's a difference. When you're nervous, you spiral in your head, chew your lip raw, run through 100 imaginary scenarios. But when you're driven, when you're staring at a crime committed in your name and you've got the receipts to prove it, the noise in your brain clears. It goes quiet, focused, cold. At 3:42 a.m., I opened my old HR file. Buried in a backup copy I'd pulled years ago, because I always pull backups, was my original onboarding packet. W-4, NDA, and the Form I-9, all physically signed, all scanned. My handwriting, neat, upright, slightly left-leaning, with a hard downward hook on the L in Lynn. I compared it to the signature on the filed attestation. It was close. Deceptively so. Someone had practiced. The loops were similar, the angle mimicked, but the pressure was all wrong. The spacing was inconsistent. The way they connected the T in Samantha to the H was off. Mine always broke in the middle. This one didn't. It tried too hard to be mine, and in doing so, missed what mattered most. It wasn't my signature, and I sure as hell hadn't authorized anyone to use it. I zoomed in on both versions, side by side, and screen captured them. Then I printed the originals. 2 sets. One for me, one for someone I knew would understand exactly what this meant. Carla Jimenez. She was one of the few people I trusted in that entire industry. We'd worked together back in my second year at Norbridge before she left to join a boutique compliance law firm that specialized in corporate filings and regulatory defense. She'd always been precise, detail-obsessed. She'd once made a partner refile a 172-page compliance plan because the metadata showed a 43-second gap in the approval chain. I emailed her at 7:03 a.m. using our old personal thread. Subject line, "Need your eyes on something sensitive." She replied in 8 minutes. "Bring everything. Don't email anything else." We met at her office later that day. No assistants, no calls, just us in a small conference room with frosted glass and a single whiteboard that said nothing but truth, evidence, plus timing. I slid the folder across the table. She opened it, laid out the documents, and didn't say a word for 5 full minutes. Then she looked up. "Who else has seen this?" she asked. "No one, not yet." "Good," she said. "Because this isn't just sloppy, this is forgery, and forgery in a regulatory attestation is federal." She didn't say the word felony. She didn't have to. It hung there between us like smoke. She tapped the forged signature with the blunt end of her pen. "This is deliberate," she said. "It wasn't scanned, it was generated. Probably stylus, but that's not even the issue." "What is?" I asked, even though I already knew. She flipped to the metadata printout. "This." She pointed to a timestamp. "This doc was finalized after your access was revoked. That alone places it outside your possible authorship." We sat there for a long moment. The hum of the HVAC filled the silence. Carla didn't look excited. She looked like someone about to call in the cavalry. "You ready to burn it down?" she asked finally. I didn't blink. "I'm ready to prove what they buried." She nodded. "Then here's what we do. You don't speak. You don't accuse. You don't even hint. Let the regulators come. Let the filings mature. When they dig, and they will, we give them a gift-wrapped truth bomb. No theory, no drama, just evidence." I slid the folder back into my bag. It wasn't about my job anymore. It wasn't about being sidelined, insulted, erased, or even humiliated. It was about the system. The truth, the law, the arrogance of thinking no one would notice because they thought the quiet woman with the spreadsheets would stay quiet forever. Let them think that. Let them keep filing fiction. I was building the final chapter, one piece of paper at a time. It came quietly, like these things always do, not with alarms or subpoenas or agents at the door, but with a polite, precise email sent at 7:51 a.m. from a legal assistant at O'Malley and Pierce LLP, subject line, "Re-attestation inquiry, commission request." I opened it and scanned the first paragraph, then read it again. "Ms. Lin, you are receiving this communication as your name has surfaced in reference to a compliance attestation filed by Norbridge Capital during the previous fiscal cycle. As per a request from the Commission, we are seeking confirmation of your participation in the execution of that document. Kindly confirm availability for a follow-up conversation, and please be prepared to share the following: any original memos regarding attestation objections, signature exemplars from your personnel file, and any other documentation pertaining to your role in that filing." I stared at the screen, not with panic, not with shock, with confirmation. They were digging. Somewhere inside Norbridge, someone had tugged on a thread that led them to a line they couldn't quite explain, and the thread had my name on it. I forwarded the message to Carla with the subject line, "They're here." She replied in less than 5 minutes. One sentence. "We play it slow, controlled, send only what they asked for. No commentary." I spent the rest of the day assembling the set. First, I pulled my original attestation memo, the one I'd blind copied to myself months ago. I verified the hash on the file, re-exported the PDF with full metadata, and made sure it showed the creation date, authorship, and internal routing. Then, I printed out my HR signature records, the onboarding forms, the NDA, the timesheet approvals, all signed by hand, all clear, unmistakable matches. Every signature with its own timestamp, its own witness in the system, its own unbroken chain of custody. Finally, I wrote a brief notarized declaration, 1 paragraph, no emotion, no narrative, just the facts. I, Samantha Lin, did not sign the attestation filed by Norbridge Capital for fiscal year-end compliance review dated submission date. I objected to its contents in writing. My name was used without my knowledge or consent. I didn't say it was forged. I didn't say who I thought did it. I didn't need to. I knew investigators. Their job isn't to guess. It's to assemble timelines, compare statements, and hold documents up to the light until the shadows reveal themselves. The next day, I got a calendar invite from the Commission's review office. Virtual meeting. Friday, 2 p.m. EST. I wore a navy blazer and didn't bother with makeup. I logged in exactly on time. The federal investigator, a woman named Clara Sloan, was already waiting. Calm, clipped tone, eyes that missed nothing. "Ms. Lin," she began, "thank you for making time." "Of course," I said. "We've reviewed the attestation in question and noted your name as signatory. We'd like to confirm, did you at any time authorize the use of your name or signature on this document?" "No," I replied. "I objected to the document in writing and refused to sign. That memo has been provided to your office." She nodded, didn't blink. "And to confirm," she continued, "you recognize the signature attributed to you as not your own?" "I do. It is not my signature." She held up a printed copy of the filing. The signature looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile somehow, like a lie shrinking under the weight of daylight. "We appreciate your clarity," she said, voice neutral but firm. "As part of our inquiry, we've requested your full personnel file and all signed documentation from Norbridge Capital. We've also issued a hold on any future attestations pending investigation outcomes." That was it. No fireworks, no courtroom dramatics, but I knew what it meant. The machine had started turning. Not because I made a scene, not because I tried to burn it down, but because I left a trail of truth in a place where liars thought no one would look. Exposure isn't fast. It doesn't roar in like a train. It creeps in, quiet, steady, like cold water rising in a locked room until everyone pretending it's dry realizes they're already soaked. The internal session wasn't on the company calendar. No Outlook invites, no announcement. Just a quiet round of hallway whispers and a string of executives disappearing behind the frosted glass of the 17th floor conference suite. Boardroom North, the one reserved for quarterly earnings calls, acquisitions, and damage control. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I was. Invited by the commission, not Norbridge. The external investigators had insisted I be present. For completeness, they'd said, though everyone in that room knew the truth. I wasn't there to speak. I was there to exist. A human paper trail, a body that couldn't be redacted, rewritten, or erased. There were 12 of us seated around the table. Darren sat 2 seats away, staring at the legal pad in front of him like it might swallow him whole if he made eye contact with anyone. The general counsel, Frederick Trask, wore the kind of forced calm that looks more like rigor mortis than confidence. To his left, someone from the board. To my right, Clara Sloan from the commission, methodically organizing her files. She didn't rush. That's what made it worse. When she finally spoke, it was without preamble. No throat clearing, no room temperature niceties. "We're here to review the integrity of the FY compliance attestation submitted under the name of Samantha Lynn," she said. "We'll begin with the internal memo received prior to submission." She opened a slim folder, took out a printed sheet, and began to read. "I am formally declining to sign the current attestation due to unresolved compliance discrepancies. Proceeding without rectifying these items constitutes a material misrepresentation of internal controls." She read the entire thing, every word, every bullet point, every timestamp. I watched Darren's jaw tighten halfway through, watched Trask blink 5 times in under a minute, watched a risk VP subtly shift his chair like he wanted to evaporate into the wall behind him. Clara set the memo down. Then she lifted the attestation. Same format, same signature line. She held it up like evidence in a courtroom drama, only without the theatrics. "Now, for comparison," she said simply, and flipped open a folder containing my personnel record. Pages were passed around. The room went still. You could hear the HVAC hum, the faint buzz of fluorescent lighting. Even the soft rattle of a spoon in a coffee mug from the break room next door felt too loud. Clara didn't comment. She just gave the silence room to breathe. It stretched. Seconds passed like molasses. Finally, the board member, an older man with a fading buzz cut and the tan lines of someone who didn't spend his life indoors, spoke. "Whose signature is that, if not hers?" No one answered. Darren stared down. Trask tapped his pen, once, twice, then stopped. Clara folded her hands on the table. "The signature does not match Ms. Lynn's historical records, nor was there any documented delegation of signing authority. Additionally, the metadata confirms the attestation was finalized during a time in which Ms. Lynn's system access had already been revoked." Still, no one said a word, so I did something small, something quiet, something devastating. I reached into my folder and placed a hard copy of my original signed memo, ink, timestamp, internal routing, gently onto the center of the table. The ink hadn't faded. The truth never does. No speech, no accusation. Just a piece of paper that said everything no one else had the spine to say out loud. The moment stretched again. Not like tension, more like reckoning. That's when Clara closed her binder and said the 6 words that changed everything in that room. "We will be issuing a formal inquiry." There was no outburst, no denial, no apology, only silence. And that silence, for the first time in months, belonged to me. They always break. The ones who smile too much, who call everything standard practice, who think policy is optional if you use enough buzzwords and bullet points, they always crack. Not because someone yells at them, but because paper doesn't flinch. And paper doesn't lie. 2 days after the meeting, Clara Sloan returned with a formal evidence request. This time, she brought a digital forensics analyst, a junior counsel from the commission, and 2 sealed envelopes. One for Norbridge's board, one for external audit. They weren't here for a chat. The board, now wide awake and legally panicked, called for internal clarification. Translation. They wanted someone to throw under the bus before the commission finished drawing the chalk outline. And Darren folded like bad drywall. It wasn't just me, he said, sweating through a linen blend he probably thought looked expensive enough to exude innocence. It was, look, this is how it's always been done. These filings get routed through legal all the time. The signature line was already preloaded in the PDF template. No one forged anything. We just standardized. Clara didn't blink. To confirm, Mr. Mays, you're suggesting it's standard practice for your department to submit regulatory attestations under a name without securing an actual signature? Darren glanced at the GC, then at the board, then back at his hands, which were fidgeting like they had their own legal counsel. I didn't think it would be an issue, he muttered, because she'd been removed from the review process? No answer. Clara turned to HR's rep, Janice Mott, who looked like she regretted every HR certification she'd ever earned. Have you located any signed attestation, electronic or physical, bearing Ms. Lynn's actual authorization? Janice flipped through her notes, her lips pressed into a hard line. We've reviewed all digital and physical HR records. There is no signed document from Ms. Lynn in the file, no authorization, no delegation of signature. The air left the room. No denials now, no polite euphemisms. It was fraud. It was document falsification, and it was closing in fast. Clara took a breath, then turned to Frederick Trask, the general counsel himself. We will need to confirm on record who instructed the attestation to be filed using Ms. Lynn's name. Trask, normally composed to the point of catatonia, suddenly looked older. Not in years, but in wear. The kind of aging that only shows up when a man who thought he'd never be held accountable realizes the tide finally turned. His hands trembled, not violently, just enough to notice, just enough to strip him of the myth of control. She never signed it, he said finally, quietly, like a confession wrapped in failure. Someone used her name, without authorization. It shouldn't have been filed that way. He looked directly at me then, and I didn't look away. That's the moment that broke the myth of their version. That's the moment my silence became the indictment. Because I hadn't stormed out, hadn't leaked documents to the press, hadn't raised my voice or burned anything down. I just waited, filed things, signed my name only when it was true. And now, the people who called me a bottleneck, a buzzkill, a low-rung policy hawk, they were tripping over their own risk memos, trying to find daylight. My restraint hadn't made me weak. It made me inevitable. The board sat in silence, absorbing the fallout, and all I could think was, this is what a clean system does. It doesn't scream. It reveals. The final report came 6 weeks later, buried in the Commission's weekly enforcement bulletin, quietly devastating in its language. Material misrepresentation of internal control compliance. It read, false certification, fabricated signature, ongoing pattern of negligent governance. They didn't mention my name until page 3, but when they did, they printed it in bold. The analyst, Samantha Lynn, formally objected to the attestation and submitted written notice declining to sign. Her objection, unacknowledged by Norbridge Capital, was later discovered to be materially accurate. The attestation was submitted without her consent, signature, or legal authorization. They called my memo Exhibit A, not just a footnote, the foundation. The case detonated from there. Frederick Trask resigned the following week. No fanfare, no farewell email, just a cleaned-out office and a vague company-wide notice citing personal time and family obligations. I imagine those obligations now include depositions and federal counsel. Darren wasn't as lucky. The Bar Association review moved quickly. In less than 90 days, his license was formally revoked. Permanent disbarment for willful misrepresentation and ethical breach in a federal attestation process. I read it twice, not out of satisfaction, out of confirmation. Norbridge hired an interim legal team, brought in a third-party compliance firm, and released a carefully manicured press statement about renewed focus on internal controls. The board called it a wake-up call. Investors called it a restructuring opportunity. I called it exactly what it was: perjury in a suit and tie. I never went back. There was no farewell lunch, no boxed-up cubicle, no awkward hug from someone who once ignored me in the hallway. I didn't need any of it. Because what I left behind wasn't a whisper or a tantrum, it was documentation. And what they lost wasn't just control of a file, it was the illusion that no one was watching. I took a consulting role soon after. Quiet firm, clean ethics, real controls. The kind of place where people read what they sign and mean it. One morning, while clearing out a backup drive, I found the original PDF of my objection memo. Still time-stamped, still signed, still sharp as the day I wrote it. I printed it and slipped it into a manila folder labeled closed. Then I sat back and sipped my coffee. Because at the end of it all, I didn't raise my voice. I just didn't sign.